Thank you very much for joining us today, and we're very pleased to be doing this with Islamic Art Circle and Indian Art Circle. So thank you to both Rosalind and Mehreen. So I'm going to hand over to Rosalind now to do the introduction. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Can you hear me? Can you hear? Good.
Yes.
Welcome to this meeting to hear more about reflections on Mughal art and culture. We're delighted to welcome Dr. Roda Ahluwalia, the editor, who will talk to us first and tell us a bit about this wonderful volume, which has 13 contributions in it. And then she'll be followed by one of the contributors, Professor Kavita Singh. Roda Ahluwalia, I'm sure, needs no introduction to most of you. She's worked on the collections in both the British Museum and the British Library. And among her publications, there's a book entitled Rajput Painting, Romantic, Divine and Courtly Art from India, which was published by the British Museum Press. And she's also lectured at SOAS and was responsible for curating and tutoring adult education courses or a course at Birkbeck. She is currently a visiting scholar of the Jnana Pravaha, sorry, I hope my pronunciation is okay, Mumbai, where she lectures on Mughal Deccani and Pahari painting for the Indian Aesthetics Program. And she's a member of the governing board of the K.R. Karma Oriental Institute. And Professor Kavita Singh, as I've already said, is one of the 13 contributors. And she's professor of the School of Arts and Aesthetics at the Jawaharlal Nehru University in Delhi, where she teaches courses in the history of Indian painting, particularly Mughal and Rajput schools, and the history and politics of museums. And she's published very, very widely, and we look forward to hearing what they all have to say. I think Alison would, if you have any questions, Alison will put them in the chat box, and hopefully at the end there will be time for these as well. Anyway, without further ado, let me pass you over. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Can you hear me? Yes. I'm delighted to introduce my new edited book, Reflections on Mughal Art and Culture. But before I begin, I would like to thank Dr. Alison Ota, Director of the Royal Asiatic Society, London, and Matty Bradley for organizing this book launch, and the IAC, the Indian Art Circle, and the Islamic Art Circle for co-hosting this event. I also want to thank Rosalind Haddon for the warm words of introduction. And last but not least, I want to thank dear Professor Kavita Singh, who has supported me in this long drawn-out venture of seminar and publication, and who, despite her busy schedule, has agreed to join us today to present her contribution to this volume titled Words and Images in Mughal Chronicles, which she will do straight after my introduction. So for those of you who do not know, let me just get the sharing screen first, and then I begin. There we go. Okay. So for those of you who do not know, the book began as a seminar held some years ago by the K.R. Karma Oriental Institute in Mumbai, which I had organized. And my vision for the seminar, as well as for the book, has been very broad-based, encouraging discussion and new insights and a perspective of, you might say, scholarly curiosity with a pan-thematic approach so that the themes offered were very wide, and scholars could contribute anything they really wished to contribute in the field of Mughal art and culture. And also on a pan-Islamicate scale, by offering contributors a section on comparative reflections between the powerful Islamicate triumvirate of the early modern period, the Safavids in Persia, the European-based Ottomans, and of course the Mughals in the Indian subcontinent. The book is a sumptuous volume with a cover. I just wanted to quickly show this to you, if you can see it. It's got a special cover, and it's been designed by Niyogi Books with color illustrations from institutions all over the world. But of course, my focus today in introducing the book is not on the design or the illustrations, but on the content, the scholarship rather, that this book offers, which of course is the book's greatest strength. 12 eminent scholars, 13 including myself, have written chapters on a wide range of topics, all of which provide new material on the art and culture of Mughal India. And I do believe that the diversity of topics under the Mughal umbrella that the book offers is its strength as well. But through its diversity, various cultural and artistic strands run through the book, binding it together, unifying it, so to speak, and giving it its own cultural and aesthetic identity in the world of art and culture, the Mughal world. And as I run through the chapters in the book, I will discuss these myriad strands as well. Some of the chapters in the book are groundbreaking, I think. Others challenge long-held ideas, yet others discuss new ideas. But I can say that in regard to all the chapters in the book, every chapter is very perceptive and insightful. So this is the contents page, as you can see, designed brilliantly by Niyogi Books. I'm going to plunge now into the articles written, beginning with the 3 groundbreaking articles on comparative cultures of the early modern Islamicate world. Professor Gulru Nechipoglu from Harvard University writes on the architectural cultures of the 3 Islamicate superpowers of the period, the Safavids, the Ottomans, and the Mughals. And she challenges the assumptions that architecture has evolved in each of these 3 regions in an unmediated fashion or a linear fashion. She shows us that the 3 empires were extremely aware of architectural happenings in each domain, and that there was perhaps a certain degree of competitiveness between the 3 superpowers. Gulru proposes that the Masjid-e-Shah in Isfahan, which you can see the top left corner here of the slide, the Sultan Ahmad Mosque on the right, which has been taken from the public domain and is not included in the book. I mean, the picture is not included in the book. And Shah Jahan's Jami Masjid, built near Shah Jahanabad, were built in competition with each other around the same time, which is around the mid-17th century. Each of these mosques attempted to outshine their predecessors, and they also responded to and reverberated with each other, bearing witness to the interconnected architectural histories of the 3 early modern empires. Gulru compares the cities of Istanbul, Shah Jahanabad, and Isfahan, as well as the choices of monuments favored by each of these superpowers. For example, the Mughals seemed to concentrate on building large mausoleums, such as Humayun's tomb, Akbar's tomb, and of course the Taj Mahal. The Safavids built shrines to their Sufi saints, such as the ones at Ardabil and Mashhad. And the Ottomans built large mosque complexes, such as the Suleymaniye complex in Istanbul. Professor Nechipoglu concludes that their shared Turco-Mongol and Persianate roots formed a common link between the 3 empires, and that these common links, as well as the deviations from their roots, enriched the architectural conversations between all three empires. Dr. Sheila Canby, retired head of the Islamic Art Department at the Metropolitan Museum, New York, writes on the influence of Persian painting on Mughal painting by focusing on a particular magnificent manuscript, the Jahangirnama, commissioned by the Persian Safavid ruler Shah Tahmasp, second quarter of the 16th century, painted by perhaps 15 brilliant Persian court painters, and its influence on Mughal painting. Some of the painters who painted for Shah Tahmasp, and we all know them, Abdul Samad, Mir Said Ali, Mir Muzaffar, and Dost Muhammad, made their way to India and were among the first artists who painted in the Mughal Kitabkhana. Here is a stunning painting on the left from the Jahangirnama of Shah Tahmasp, attributed to the Persian painter Dost Muhammad. Sheila Canby explores why some early Safavid conventions and compositions, in particular those from the Jahangirnama, were more popular than others in Mughal works and continued to be copied and adapted well into the 17th century, demonstrating the enduring power of the Jahangirnama of Shah Tahmasp in Mughal painting. The painting on the right, painted by a Mughal artist, has a similar composition to the Jahangirnama painting on the left, with many Persian tropes adapted from the original Persian painting. And if you look closely, you can see very many similar compositional features in the two paintings. And our third chapter on comparative reflections has been researched by Professor Sunil Sharma, who gives us a fascinating study on the Indian woman in a Persianate world. And the title of his article is The Indian Woman in a Persianate World, Comparisons Across Mughal, Safavid, and Ottoman Literary and Visual Cultures. In his article, he states that the Indian woman fascinated poets and painters in Safavid Iran, particularly as Iranian women at the time were strictly veiled. And popular works on alluring and wily females from India were featured in literature and paintings in narratives such as the Suz-o Gudaz, Haft Paikar, Hasht Bihisht, and Gulzar-e Abbasi. And Persian heroines such as Shirin of Shirin Farhad, Zuleikha, and Laila of Laila Majnun competed with real Indian heroines such as Padmavati and Rupmati in the canons of Mughal literature and painting. So there was a lot of interaction, as we all know, between Safavid Iran and Mughal India. And there was a lot more awareness of the Indian woman in Safavid culture and vice versa, compared with perceptions of the Indian woman in Ottoman lands, in which the Indian woman, for reasons unknown to us, did not appear to garner any special status. Sharma refers to a representation of an Indian woman in a late 18th century Ottoman literary text called the Jahangirnama, which means Book of Women, in which the Indian woman is depicted as just another ordinary woman. And you can see the picture here in this slide. Apart from her dusky complexion and a palm tree in the distance, there is nothing that seems to identify her as being Indian. I'm going to move on to talk about another chapter about women in the book, that of Dr. Mika Natif, professor at George Washington University, who ventures into the field of gender studies, exploring the relationship between gender, power, and visuality. She discusses the images of two prominent women at Akbar's court, portrayed in illustrated histories, such as the Akbarnama and the Jahangirnama. Those of Mahim Anga, Akbar's foster mother, who played an important role in Akbar's early life and held an important position at court, and Hamida Banu Begum, Akbar's mother, who helped Akbar rule when Akbar was away from court. One can see Hamida Banu Begum seated here. It's a very famous painting, Birth of a Prince. Here she is, seated, probably presiding over the birth of future heir to the throne, Prince Salim. It's a folio intended for the Jahangirnama. It's attributed to Bishandas. And one can see that Hamida Banu Begum is seated in a very central position. In fact, the painter seems to focus on her centrality and on her as a figure of authority in the painting. Mika argues that the portraits of both Hamida Banu and Mahim Anga were symbolic affirmations of dynastic legitimacy and authority because of their Central Asian Timurid heritage. The Mughals were extremely aware of and biased toward their Turco-Mongol heritage, and because of this esteemed status, Hamida Banu's and Mahim Anga's portrayal in illustrated histories does not differ from the representation of men. This is Mika's conclusion. And you can see in this double-page Akbarnama painting, Mahim Anga is seated next to the young Emperor Akbar, presiding over the marriage festivities of her eldest son. And she again has a position of authority and centrality. She's not veiled. She is supporting Mika's argument. The Central Asian Timurid legacy of the Mughals, or their Turco-Mongol Persianate heritage, of which they were extremely aware, as I've just mentioned, and biased towards, is a recurring theme in various chapters in the book. And it runs like a thread through them. So this is one of the threads I'm talking about. Dr. Mika's chapter, it's mentioned in Dr. Mika's chapter, as we have seen here, and is again mentioned in Professor Guru Necipoglu's chapter. Professor Necipoglu postulates a paradigm in which each of the three superpowers shared a common cultural, semi-nomadic, Turco-Mongol, Persianate heritage, which binds them into a continuous zone. And she begins her article discussing this important phenomenon or criterion. Another obvious theme that runs as a strand through the book and that unites the diversity of chapters in the book is obviously the effective visual language of Mughal art, which derives from Islamicate culture and the Islamicate worldview. Simply stated, these are the principles of geometry, symmetry, rhythm and harmony, the symbolism of the Islamic ornament, as well as metaphors used in Islamic art. Among the many examples in the book that elucidate our understanding of these principles and that state them in various chapters is, the first one that comes to mind is the Shamsa. It's a geometrical symbol of the sun, and it precedes every important royal manuscript commissioned. Ursula Sims Williams, lead curator of the Persian collections in the British Library, shows us a Shamsa that occurred in the beginning of a 15th century Hamza of Nizami manuscript in the Imperial Library of the Mughals, with Jahangir's and Shah Jahan's inscriptions on it. And her article is titled The Imperial Library of the Mughals, the British Library Collection. The Aini Akbari, compiled by Abu al-Fazal, Akbar's historian, compares Emperor Akbar to the glory of the sun. So in effect, the Shamsa symbolically represents the sun as well as the emperor. Ursula in her article goes on to discuss 4 imperial manuscripts commissioned in the Kitab Khana, which are now housed in the British Library in London. And she traces the ownership of these manuscripts, which makes for extremely interesting and actually fascinating reading. Apart from the obvious symmetry and harmony of Islamicate art that can be seen in the Taj Mahal or in Humayun's tomb, symmetry can also be seen in Mughal paintings, In particular, the Padshahnama paintings, of which there are examples in Dr. Subhash Parihar's chapter on Mughal murals, and one example that Dr. Kavita Singh is going to talk to you about later on. Padshahnama paintings are so symmetrical as to be drawn in replication on either side of an imaginary line drawn through the center, the vertical center of the page. So in replication on either side. And this is, of course, the well-known principle of Karina or counter image, which Professor Ebba Koch has elucidated and written on in a previous publication. Dr. Subhash Parihar's chapter is titled Figurative Mughal Murals, Evidence from Miniature Painting. Murals were painted by the Mughals on their architectural surfaces, and though some can still be seen, others that did exist at Fatehpur Sikri in Delhi no longer exist, possibly owing to the vagaries of weather and time. An important source of Mughal murals, however, is evidenced in Mughal miniature painting. And Dr. Parihar shows us some examples in his study, giving us a glimpse of what the architectural surfaces must have looked like in the Mughal period. So this is a painting from the Padshahnama, as I mentioned, of Jahangir presenting Khurram with a turban ornament. Just trying to get my cursor. It's gone off screen. Yeah, it is. And you can see paintings of Christ and the Madonna on the upper register of the Divaniyam at Bandu. Below that, we see floral sprays painted on the wall, and then below the seated Jahangir are two holy men, one holding a sword, the other holding a book. And they stand behind the earth, which is represented as a hemisphere. And below the earth, a lion and a cow are seated in perfect companionship with each other, implying Jahangir's peaceful reign. And of course, we relate Mughal gardens to the principles of geometry, rhythm, and symmetry. Dr. Laura Parodi, in her chapter on Mughal gardens, begins by stating that gardens are often described as quadripartite, charbagh gardens. Charbagh, you know the meaning, char means four, bagh, garden. And gardens are usually associated with the concept of paradise on earth. I mean, that's what we've always been led to believe. She, however, challenges this myth. She challenges the charbagh and the paradisiacal narrative as mere scholarly conjecture, as she says there is negligible evidence of the paradise garden concept or of gardens being built on a quadripartite plan before the early modern era. And there's no evidence of it in Timurid or Mughal early sources. She argues then that Timurid and early Mughal sources refer to charbaghs as terraced estates built on slopes or gradients with terraces and pools governed by function rather than form, and that they were used for residential and administrative purposes. She goes on to classify Mughal gardens in her chapter in the book titled Mughal Garden Typologies Reconsidered. Plant and animal forms common in Islamicate art can be seen in some of the hardstone examples from Susan Strong's chapter on the lapidary arts in the Mughal Empire, as well as Dr. Anamika Pathak's chapter on decorative art objects. Susan needs no introduction. I'm sure all of you know she's a lead curator of the Asian collections in the Victoria and Albert Museum. Dr. Anamika Pathak is a retired curator of the National Museum at Delhi. A pendant made of jade, for example, from the collection in the V&A Museum has birds made of rubies flying around a large flower with ruby petals. There are floral motifs incised on a prolific number of the rock crystal wine bowls and jade boxes, also in Susan's chapter. Object art and jewelry made of hard stones such as agate, cornelian, rock crystal and jade, made in Mughal lapidaries or karkhanas, is the subject of Susan's article, which focuses on later object art, later Mughal objects, filling a lacuna of neglect in the field of decorative art studies. Dr. Vivek Gupta combines visual and textual sources to discover the culture of and experientially engage with the Mughal city of Burhanpur. Vivek begins his article with a poem written in the city by Abdul Rahim Khan Khanan called Nagar Shobha, or Splendor of the City, as an entry point to render a fascinating account of the textile culture in the city of Burhanpur. He refers to the popularity of the poppy motif on kalamkaris or chintz textiles produced at Burhanpur for home consumption, as well as exported to the Armenian community in New Julfa and as far as Genoa through Armenian merchants. Vivek Gupta states that this motif has become an easily identifiable motif in Mughal visual culture. Actually, poppy served as one of the most common plants in Mughal ornament from the late 17th to the 18th centuries. And so we have flower forms again, forming a common thread through various chapters in the book, linking things together. And depictions of the poppy motif are found on hookah bowls as well, pointing to the possible association of this plant with opium. In particular, the poppy motif produced on textiles from Burhanpur appears to hint at the pleasure of opium, as poppies were harvested and opium sold in neighboring districts of the northern Deccan and Malwa during the 17th century. Another important theme that is foregrounded in various chapters in the book and runs like a thread through them is that of the multiculturalism of the empire under the reigns of Akbar, Jahangir, and Shah Jahan. Professor Catherine Asher, in her article titled Muslim Kings, Hindu Temples, The Legacy of India's Multicultural History, discusses the construction of Hindu temples under Mughal rule rather than the oft-mentioned destruction. Temple building began as a result of Akbar's Sul-e-Kul, or peace for all, policy of inclusion, which encouraged sub-imperial patronage by the nobility, both the Islamic nobility, who were encouraged to commission manuscripts and the building of mosques, and of course the Rajput nobility, the Hindu nobility, who were encouraged to build temples and commission Hindu illustrated manuscripts. The Kachwaha Rajputs of Amber, Jaipur, the Bundel Rajas of Bundelkhand, and the Ranas of Mewar all built a prolific number of temples during the reigns of Akbar, Jahangir, and Shah Jahan. And Professor Asher discusses their temple patronage in her chapter in the book, focusing on the Kachwahas as a case study. Dr. Vivek Gupta's chapter begins with the poem, as I mentioned before, Nagar Shobha, which means splendor of the city, written in Hindi by Abdul Rahim Khan Khanan, Akbar's and Jahangir's commander-in-chief of the army, who was not only a scholar, as I'm sure most of you know, not only of Persian and Chagatai Turki, but also of Sanskrit and Hindi, depicting the Mughals' adoption of indigenous culture and the multiculturalism of society that existed in Mughal India. And I mention the theme of multiculturalism as well in my article on Nanha, a long forgotten painter who painted for both Akbar and Jahangir, when I discuss Akbar's policy of Sul-e-Kul as being one of the most important reasons for the wholehearted adoption of European artistic practices that occurred during the latter years of Akbar's reign through Jahangir's. In my chapter titled A Noteworthy Ustad in the Imperial Mughal Kitab Khane of Akbar and Jahangir, I discuss the rise of portraiture and naturalism in Mughal painting by focusing on changes in the visual language and content of painting from the late Akbari period to the Jahangiri one, a period of around 20 years, which is an important period in the imperial Kitabkhana that reflects many changes occurring in the Kitabkhana at that time. I traced the career of a relatively unknown master painter called Nanha, and who had a predilection for painting chehere or faces with uncanny precision. And I add Nanha's narrative into the broader context of my article. This is one of Nanha's paintings depicting the Rana of Mewar submitting to Prince Khurram. And you can see that every face here is a portrait, is an individual visage. And you can actually see the painter Nana here, seated sketching from real life. He's depicted sketching from real life, which I call the real life genre that this painter possibly introduced into the Kitabkhana at the time. When I bring Nanha into the discussion, I argue that he was an artist ahead of his time, that he preempted the visual language of Jahangiri works from 1595 onward, which is 10 years before Jahangir ascended the throne, and that Nanha should be remembered for all time as an ustad who entered into the spirit of the subject being painted. I think I will end here now. I hope I have managed to impart the essence of the book to all of you, and I'll be happy to answer questions on the book about it later on. I now hand over to Professor Kavita Singh, who will speak on her contribution to the volume, Words and Images in Mughal Chronicles. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Rhoda. I am so proud to be part of this beautiful book. And I want to thank you for including me in it and doing all the hard work of putting this wonderful thing together. I also am very grateful that the Royal Asiatic Society has given us this opportunity to speak to you about this book. And so I want to thank all of you who've been involved in making this evening possible. So I'd like to thank Alison Ota, Rosalind Haddon, Merin Chida Razvi, and of course, Matty Bradley for everything that they've done for today. In the essay that I wrote for Rhoda's book, I hope to look at Mughal historical manuscripts to open a discussion about the words in these books, the images in these books, and the gaps that exist between the words and images. I'd like to begin today's presentation by starting with an image which is taken from a very well-known page of a Mughal Akhlaq-e-Nasiri manuscript. And the scene that we are seeing here is usually identified as showing a scene in an atelier in which we can see a young man, possibly a prince because he's dressed in golden robes, receiving instruction from a master. And we can see that he is holding a pen and practicing calligraphy on a piece of paper. But even though he is writing, it's worth noting the little cups of color that lie on the carpet beside his pen case. And so clearly, what he learns in this room covers not just the art of calligraphy, but the art of painting as well. And so we are seeing here a pupil who is learning the two key skills which would be needed to produce beautiful books. And as though the interrelationship between these two arts needed to be stressed even more clearly in the painting, we see that on a step below this young princely learner, there is an artist and a calligrapher who are facing each other and seated on the same carpet face to face. So a scene like this, or indeed a scene like this one, sorry, I should go to the next image. Yeah, a scene like this one, which is the celebrated colophon page from the Khamsa of Nizami, which also show a calligrapher and a painter working companionably side by side, suggests that there was a very close collaboration between these two kinds of artists in the Kitab Khana, and therefore equally there would be a very close collaboration between the images in the book and the words upon the page. Now, as two of the major contributors to the making of the book, it's only natural that the artist and the calligrapher should be shown working side by side. But what about the works that they produced? Is it really true that the words and pictures in a book were as companionable as their makers are shown to be in these images? Did the text and the image always work in unison, the one echoing or amplifying or embellishing and clarifying the other? Or did they sometimes clash with each other, offering different takes on the same narratives, takes that were not just complementary to each other, but that sometimes actively disagreed, contradicted, and even undercut one another? And if this was the case, if the image was at times at variance with the very text that it was to illustrate, what kind of questions would that raise for us? Should we see the discrepancy between the visual and the textual narrative as something that is inevitable, something that comes naturally out of the difference between the two mediums, or as simply reflecting the difference in the authorial voice of the painter and of the writer? Or was there a structural difference between the role that was to be played by the textual chronicler and the role that was to be played by the artist? Were images expected to perform a function that was different from that of the text? And then let's take a step back from the makers of the book to think about the readers of the book. And let's think about them being presented with words and images that have gaps between them. What happens to a reader who is presented with versions of the same event within the covers of the same book, or indeed on facing pages, which actually seem to clash with each other or have a friction with each other? We need to think of how the reader might have then absorbed the text and the image, and most significantly, how they might have thought about the gap between the two. Because wouldn't this gap itself become something that was visible to the reader? And if so, would it not be seen as also something meaningful, something that was productive of a semantics of its own? Would the gap between the word and the image not become a space in which a third text would arise, one that is not entirely written in the words, not entirely rendered in the pictures, but is created in the reader's mind as he mentally traverses the distance between these two? These are some of the conjectures that came to my mind. And in the essay that I wrote for, I wanted to pursue this by studying a number of Mughal paintings in conjunction with the texts that they accompanied. And so for the purposes of this essay, I actually chose to look at paintings that were drawn not from literary texts, but from historical manuscripts. And not just any historical manuscript, but from the Padshahnama, the Jahangirnama, and the Akbarnama, all of which were official chronicles of the emperor's own lives. And I chose to look at paintings from these books for some very obvious reasons. Because when the artist was tasked with illustrating a literary text, an adventure story, a love story, or a fable, he would have been encouraged, or he would have been rewarded for coming up with an interpretation that was original, one that would play with the text, that would go beyond the text. But in the case of the copies of books that were the official authorized biographies of emperors, they would have operated in another manner entirely, because when the production of these books was underway, they were probably the most prestigious projects in the atelier, and being very close to the patron's heart, being of tremendous propaganda use, one imagines that every aspect of their contents, from their text to the calligraphy, from the paintings to the border decoration or the binding would have all been very closely supervised. And therefore, the obligation that would have been there to adhere to not the truth, but to the approved version of events would have been very strongly felt. So when text and image are at variance with each other in such manuscripts, their divergence from each other cannot be accidental. And indeed, it must be programmatic. It must be part of the way in which the books were supposed to communicate. It was part of the way in which these books bore meaning. Today, time is short, so I will share with you only one section of my paper for Roda, and that is the section that deals with a celebrated painting from the Padshahnama. In a manuscript in which almost every painting is of extraordinary quality, the leaf that shows the death of Khan Jahan Lodi is considered a particular masterpiece. It shows the beheading of a man called Pir Khan or Khan Jahan Lodi, a man who had once been in Shah Jahan's service but had betrayed him. And since his rebellion offered a serious challenge to Shah Jahan's authority, the emperor's forces pursued Khan Jahan Lodi for 2 years before they finally cut him down. In the end, Khan Jahan Lodi was defeated, his head was cut off, and it was sent to be displayed at the gate of the imperial fort of Agra. Now, the majority of the 44 sumptuous illustrations in the Padshahnama are darbar scenes, in which we tend to see an enthroned Shah Jahan presiding over a court that is thickly populated with courtiers and guards and attendants. Our painting, which has been masterfully rendered by the artist Abid, also shows a very carefully made assembly of generals and officials from Shah Jahan's court. However, the emperor is absent. The scene is set outdoors in a stylized mountainscape, which is reminiscent of Persian painting. A row of soldiers peeps over the horizon to gaze at the event that is taking place in the foreground. And here in the foreground of the painting, 2 men are bent over a very difficult task because they are sawing through the bones and the sinews of the rebel governor's neck in order to behead him. And although he is still alive, the blood has drained out of Khan Jahan's body. His face is already taking on the pallor of death. And on the ground nearby are the heads of others who have been already executed. And these decapitated heads are gray, in fact, nearly black, entirely lacking in lifeblood. Now, when we look at this painting with its detailed rendering of people and things, we know that we are seeing a particular man at a particular moment in a particularly grisly event. And yet, for all its attention to detail and its horrifyingly fascinating rendering of death and decaying flesh, this painting cannot be taken as an accurate eyewitness account because it offers a narrative of Khan Jahan's death that veers very far from the account given in the Padshahnama's text. We know, for instance, that while Khan Jahan's head was indeed cut off, and it was sent to Shah Jahan as a trophy, it was cut off from a body that was already dead, that had been pierced by the lance of Madho Singh of Bundi, a Rajput prince who was in Shah Jahan's service. According to Lahori's text, Madho Singh was in the party that launched the final assault on Khan Jahan Lodi, and he killed the former governor as well as 2 of his sons. Now, Madho Singh is shown in the painting. He's standing at the lower right, wearing orange, and prominently holding the lance that he has wielded with such success today. But while the figure of the Rajput prince is prominent, it is also very passive. He witnesses the execution rather than performing it. The middle register of this painting is dominated by the figures of 2 symmetrically arranged warriors who are standing beside their horses. They are the two leaders of the force that had pursued Khan Jahan Lodi. On the left, clad in armor, is Abdullah Khan, and on the right, wearing a white jama, is Sayyid Muzaffar Khan Bara. The author of the Padshahnama, Lahori, also tells us that it was Abdullah Khan who had personally cut off the head of Khan Jahan's Lodi from his dead body and had ensured that it was dispatched to Shah Jahan. And in fact, several Mughal albums preserve portraits of Abdullah Khan, showing him holding Khan Jahan Lodi's severed head, suggesting that he is remembered chiefly for this triumph, for which he was also very richly rewarded by Shah Jahan. And yet, when we look at the painting, like Madhu Singh, Abdullah Khan is shown simply attending Khan Jahan's decapitation rather than performing it. So then we have to ask that if agency has been taken away from the two main actors in this historical drama, the man who actually killed Khan Jahan and the man who actually decapitated Khan Jahan, then to whom has agency been given in their stead? Who are these two figures that are shown cutting off Khan Jahan's head as though they were executing a living man? There are two words written in black ink on the shoulder of the man who faces us. And in its format, it resembles the small inscriptions that are present in many darbar scenes to identify every courtier present there. However, rather than being a personal name, this inscription simply reads Shah Jahani, someone who belongs to or is of Shah Jahan. The other figure actually bears a subtler inscription because woven into the edge of his coat is a benediction wishing the emperor a long life. And so from these inscriptions, it becomes clear that Abid doesn't intend for these executioners to be identified as individuals who were involved in the capture of Shah Jahan. Rather, they are abstract figures that emblematize service to Shah Jahan. So if the two men who actually killed and beheaded Khan Jahan Lodi seem merely to be attending on the scene, then in a twist that I find most disturbing, Khan Jahan Lodi also is made to attend the scene of his own beheading. Because instead of showing him as being already dead when his head was cut off, Abid paints Khan Jahan as a living, sentient and conscious figure with wide open eyes. In the hands of the artist, Abid, Khan Jahan's last moments seem to be filled with a painful realization. It is as though he understands and is bearing witness to what he has done to deserve this fate. It seems to me that in many ways, Khan Jahan's open eyes are the crux of a painting whose central theme seems to be the witnessing of a wrathful justice being done, because the act of seeing is reinforced multiple times in this painting, as the execution is witnessed by so many actors in the scene. You have the theatrical chorus of soldiers arranged behind the horizon line in the background. You have the knot of soldiers in the foreground. You have the solemn commanders who are standing by their horses, watching what is being done. And in contrast to all those who look upon the event, the decapitated heads that lie on the ground all have their eyes shut, as though they do not deserve to look upon the majesty of this scene. But whose majesty is it that these traitors are not allowed to see? If we compare this painting with the darbar scenes that are seen so frequently in the Padshahnama, we see that the darbar scenes are arranged in 3 registers that reproduce the hierarchical space of the Shah Jahani Darbar Hall. And so in these paintings, the lowest register generally rank who stand within the golden or the silver railings of the hall. And the highest register, of course, is reserved for the emperor himself, who occupies this magnificently decorated and elevated throne. Now, when we juxtapose the Darbar scene with Abid's death of Khan Jahan Lodi, we can see how the outdoor scene reproduces the format of the formal audience at court. Because Madho Singh, or the men who are actually cutting off the head of Khan Jahan Lodi, are located at the lowest register as though they were mere servants of the court. And by placing the two commanders above the scrum of soldiers and executioners, Abid has lifted them to the level of high-ranking courtiers who stand close to their ruler in the Darbar. Now, above these men, there rises a chinar tree, a tree that was beloved of Mughal rulers and that was dubbed in Mughal poetry as the king of trees. Could the king of trees stand in for the king of men? As we look more closely at this painting, we see how the ground beneath the chinar is sprinkled with flowers. And although these seem to be part of the landscape, the flowers are concentrated only at the foot of the tree, as though forming a decorative carpet for it. And this becomes very similar to the way in which carpets, hangings, wall panels, inlays get clustered with bare flowers, get clustered around Shah Jahan's throne, as though concentrating all of nature's beauty around his presence. So their location in this painting, our painting, at the base of the chinar, also confirms that the tree becomes a metaphor in the world of this painting for Shah Jahan's own self. When Shah Jahan sent his forces to hunt down Khan Jahan Lodi, he remained in the capital. He was far from the battlefield. And yet, by imposing the structure of the Darbar upon the battlefield, and by letting the symbolic representation of the emperor preside over the scene, Abid finds a way to make Shah Jahan present despite his absence. And so now the shifting of agency from the actors begins to make sense. Abid doesn't deny the role of Madho Singh or of Abdullah Khan. He gives both of them a prominent place in his composition, but he takes their actions away from them. And by doing this, Abid is suggesting that Madho Singh and Abdullah Khan were simply instruments of the emperor's will. What they did was not of their doing. It was Shah Jahan's might that animated them. Those who would have held the Padshahnama book in their hands and would have turned its pages would have seen Abid's painting alongside a text that describes the campaign against Khan Jahan Lodi in great detail. And there the skirmishes between the imperial and the rebel forces are recounted over several pages. There is no obfuscation of the role of either Madho Singh or Abdullah Khan. Seen alongside the text then, Abid's manipulation of the scene would have become very clearly visible to the reader. And the gap between the text's account and the paintings would have become a very important part of the painting's rhetorical flourish, and it would have prompted the reader to seek out its implications. So by turning the battlefield into an alfresco darbar, by suggesting the omnipresence of a faraway ruler, by making warriors witnesses rather than actors, by rendering Khan Jahan Lodi as alive so he could witness his own beheading, and by doing all of this next to a text that gives a painstaking and plodding account of the incident, Abid is actually showing us how a painting can offer a layered and symbolic account of the same event, one that functions as an interpretation rather than a representation. The painting doesn't deviate from the text so much as it transcends it by altering and arranging pictorial space and composition and motifs. Abid seems to be making a claim here for the art of painting, arguing that it can have a status that is higher than that of prose. I'll end here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I mean, this is absolutely a wonderful publication, and I had one comment: how can I get my hands on this? So I think there are lots of, well, many of us who are ready to buy it. And I was asked about the link, but I know that Rhoda tried very valiantly and to organize the link, but it turned out to be too complicated and probably too expensive. So what I would recommend is that you purchase it on Amazon. All right. So I'm just going to see if there are any questions on the chat, but I wanted to ask. I found that absolutely fascinating, Kavita. It was just absolutely wonderful and so interesting. I mean, when you talked about agency in this, do you think it was all Abid who formulated on how this could be interpreted, or was the input from other people, or do you think?
So the Padshahnama illustrations are highly ideologically charged, and of course the scholar who has done the most on this is Ebba Koch, who has these brilliant interpretations of every microscopic detail in these paintings. But even among the Padshahnama paintings, the majority of which are set in the palace, this painting really seems like an outlier. And the way in which it is choreographed, the stylization, the high degree of stylization that there is in this painting actually seems to go against the grain of a lot of Abid's work, which is generally more naturalistic. There's this beautiful painting of Shah Jahan on the Peacock Throne that's in the San Diego Museum, for instance, and it doesn't have this slightly archaistic quality and this theatrical quality that Abid has brought in here. So I think Abid really was playing or experimenting with this and was conscious of what kind of poetic effects he was creating here. I think it was quite a deliberate gamble, and perhaps it was even something that he might have done on his own bat and wondered whether it would be approved or not. No.
Thank you. I mean, I shall look at all those paintings very differently now. You've opened my eyes. It was so interesting. I don't know if we have any other. Mainly, it's about how people can get their hands on the book. So Matty's put a link up actually for everyone to see, so you can see that on the chat, and there's the email address or the link to it. So I don't know if anyone has any other questions. Rhoda, would you like to say anything else, or to add to this one, your wonderful publication?
Yes, maybe I can just say that all the chapters in the book offer something insightful, something new, like Kavita's. So even though Kavita's is, of course, brilliant, being Kavita, there are many others that are really very good as well. So I would suggest just buy the book and read the book. And it is available if you just go on amazon.co.uk. It's taken a long time to publish and a long time to come here. It's been sort of a grueling few years, but I must say all the contributors have been just extremely supportive and wonderful about everything. And it was actually supposed to have been made available in 2020, but then the pandemic came along, and so everything got delayed. So it's been there, it's been available in India for some time, but it's just recently come to the UK and I think the US as well in October. And Amazon is the best place to get it. I did try to get some sort of discount, but I just couldn't. It was too complicated. And anyway, they couldn't beat the Amazon price. So, you might as well get it from Amazon.
Right. Well, thank you. Thank you very much.
Welcome.
I have another message. I just, right. Well, we have text on the chat. Amazing introduction, riveting talks. So congratulations, etc., etc. And I'm sure Matty will save these for you. And I think people, you've really, I think our eyes have been opened in many ways, and I really look forward to reading the other articles as well, and of course your both of yours. So I think we will finish there. I should say there is a recording of this that will go on to our YouTube channel, so you'll all be able to see it. And I would just like to thank Roda and Kavita very much for letting us have a look and a taste before we start really setting into it and getting to grips with it. And of course I'd like to thank Rosalind as well, Islamic Art Circle, and Mehreen, of course, of Indian Art Circle, and Matty, as always, keeping us going and keeping our sort of links maintained. So thank you very much, everyone, and good night. And I hope you'll join us for more lectures later on in September and October. And we will send you the chat notes, I think, because I think you should both of you read them. They are really very, very nice and have lots of interesting comments. All right. So thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank
and
you.
thanks, Kavita, for staying awake so late at night.
Yes, I'm sorry.
I don't know what the time is.
What time is it with you, Kavita?
Yes,
Thank
it's only
you so
11.
much for that. Yeah.
Well, you're looking remarkably well. So
Yes.
anyway, so thank you. That's great.
Good night.
Thank you
Thank
very
you.
much.
Good night. Good
Thank
night.
you very much.